You go out and you buy a Rolls Royce and you never service it, and then you moan when the thing packs up. I mean, you've spent, as the end users spend a lot of money on fire detection systems. So to spend a couple of rand to get a service is great.
Hi, Hilton here from the FDIA. I'm sitting with our chairman, Clive Ford, and I think today we are discussing what, in my opinion, is one of the most important parts of any fire detection system or any fire-related system, and that is maintenance. Clive, thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
From a contractor's point of view, obviously I come from the supply side. From a contractor's point of view, how would you say, how important is maintenance, obviously? And in terms of customers understanding what the standard requirements and what is actually required, can you pass on some advice to everybody as to what to look out for in terms of, is the maintenance being done properly? Is the documentation right? And what do the standards say?
Great. Thanks, Hilton. Look, as a contractor, it's always nice to get big projects and you go and install big systems and you make lots of money. But at the end of the day, the maintenance part of it is super important. If you install a system and it doesn't get maintained, you have got no idea if it's working. So the maintenance is covered in the standard. It's an addendum at the end of the standard, 10139. And it's a bit confusing the way it's worded and people don't always understand it. So what it says is that within a year period, the whole system needs to be tested. But you need to have at least 2 visits from your service company within that year period. So ultimately, within every 6 months, the system should be tested at some point. So the idea is that, so the idea is that we go and look at the system, we test detectors, we test core points and so on over the year period. Depending on the layout and depending on the client's requirements and where the equipment is installed. If it's a very dirty environment, then you do it quicker. If it's a clean environment, 6 months is good. But ultimately, the system, and this is where people get confused. They see a year, so they only want to service it a year. It needs to be looked at least every 6 months. Within that time period, the end user also has responsibilities. They've got to look at their system daily to see there's no faults on it. They've got to look at it weekly to make sure that the batteries are working, that everything is working. And the standard also specifies that you've got to test the core point and test the sounders so that your staff are used to the alarms that are happening.
And I think on top of that, I would assume it's quite important that the company doing the service, obviously we would encourage people to use FDIA members as that what is we're about. But in terms of the requirements, I assume that, that they should be using an SAQCC qualified serviceman at least.
Absolutely, yeah. So now we got 2 sort of not conflicting, but 2 areas that we're looking at here. FDIA is the Fire Detection Industry Association, and we vet companies that join the FDIA to make sure that they got the correct people in place, that they got qualified people working on the systems, and they got designers and so on. SAQCC registers technicians. So the standard says you should have a competent person doing the work. The only way that you as an end user can see that you are competent is by having an SAQCC card that says, I am a serviceman. And that protects the end user at the end of the day. And that is a mandate from the Department of Employment and Labor that has said that people have to be registered. If you're going to work on the fire detection system or fire system, you have to be registered as a technician, as an designer, as a installer, and so on.
Yeah, well, I think it's important that the person, I wouldn't personally drop my car off at somebody that wasn't a mechanic to service, which kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
In your time in the industry, do you find that there's a lot of pushback in terms of maintenance, people signing service level agreements with you? I know on the big tenders that generally it goes out to tender, and then the company that has installed it isn't required to look after it for a year. Post that, I assume that they're often not SLAs and stuff brought into place, and they've spent a fortune on a system, yet it's not working.
It's like what we were discussing earlier. You go out and you buy a Rolls Royce and you never service it, and then you moan when the thing packs up. I mean, the end users spend a lot of money on fire detection systems. So to spend a couple of rand to get a service is great. But yes, we're fortunate that most of our clients are industrial. We do very little commercial work. So I'm talking now as me as a contractor. So they understand the risks that are involved with having a huge fire on an industrial plant. A lot of the commercial sites, to get a service agreement with those people is very difficult. And the standard, once again, 10139 says that you should have your system serviced by a competent service company. And the only way that you can know that is by vetting the people, having a look at the SAQCC registered service, and be aware that you're going to look for a detection and gas serviceman. You're not a fire extinguisher serviceman to service your detection system.
Yeah, I think from a supplier's point of view, we also encourage maintenance, and a lot of product warranties are based on maintenance, such as going back to referring to the car industry. If you don't service your car and the engine packs up, unfortunately, you're liable for the cost, and it's not a manufacturer's blame. In terms of the industrial sector, it obviously falls outside of the scope of 10139.
Yeah.
So just for anybody watching that is in that sector, should it be a mining, power generation, petrochem, what would your recommendations be? Obviously, depending on how harsh the requirements are, what would your recommendations as a contractor working in that field in terms of how regularly they should do maintenance?
And again, you're going to now have a computer room, which is a clean environment. So there we're going on to a different subject now. Where you got gas suppression, that's got a different maintenance requirement, which I'll talk about now. But if you've got a clean room like a substation, which is relatively clean, then once every 3 months, once every 6 months is good for a service. But then you do get some plants that are, there's equipment installed on coal conveyor belts, for instance, where if you don't go and clean that thing every couple of days, it's not going to work properly. I mentioned the gas suppression in server rooms, for instance. So that's a different standard to 10139. And that specifies quite clearly that you're in a server room, 14520. Am I right?
14520, 369 or 246,
yeah,
depending on which design criteria we're following.
The detection side of the suppression control needs to be serviced every 3 months. And the gas suppression itself, the cylinders, need to be serviced every 6 months. So that is something that you need to keep in mind, is if you've got a gas suppression system, the detection needs to be serviced every 3 months, because if it's not serviced, you could have a false discharge, and then that costs you lots of money. If it's a CO2 system and there's somebody in there, it could have dire consequences. So straightforward detection, a minimum of every 6 months, depending on your area that the equipment is installed into. It can be 3 months, it can even be down to a month. But for gas suppression areas, every 3 months you need to service the detection.
I think that it's a good time to mention that as the Fire Detection Industry Association, we obviously take the maintenance side of the industry extremely seriously. And we have, just for everybody watching the video, we have in fact started a service division specifically for companies that are focused on maintenance. I think that needs to be a big drive, and information like this is relevant to the sector. And hopefully, the credibility of the name of the Fire Detection Industry Association that we're trying to build and uplift the industry, that people look for companies registered as service companies, and that they tick all the boxes. Maybe you can just to finish off, just run through, if an end user has watched this video and they're worried about their maintenance, maybe you just want to run through, if they've got a logbook, just what they should look for, what they should be doing, and what their responsibility is and what the responsibility of the contractor is.
All right. So any competent contractor, firstly of all, there should be a logbook on site, so that you can, the end user, if he has false alarms or any problems on the system, he can log it in the logbook. The contractor then comes to site, he looks at the logbook, and he can pick up if there's issues on the system. Secondly of all, he's going to note in the logbook that he's doing a service on the date and the time and so on. And then he should have a service sheet of some sort, that he's tested the detectors, that he's checked the dates on the batteries, that he's checked that there's that there's no alarms on the panel. And there's a whole raft of points that the standard also asks for, that you got to do, that you got to look at these points to make sure that the system is working. Also, if the end user gets a new contractor in to come and start servicing, so he's had a service agreement with company A for some time, and he decides, all right, company A is no longer around, he wants to deal with company B. The first service should be seen as a complete, almost a recommissioning of the service. Every single point has to be tested, every single, your cause and effect matrix has to be checked. And without having your documentation on site, which should be there to be compliant, the service company doesn't know what the system is supposed to do. So you could go and test the smoke detection system in the Santon Hotel, and all of a sudden home all the lifts because there's no documentation to say what the system has to be. So the on-site documentation is really critical, the compliance certificates of what has been installed, and then any notes of any faults and things that have been happening on the system over a time period. And the contractor has to hand over some kind of certificate to say, I'm responsible, I tested the system and it's compliant to the standard and it's doing what it should do, or not.
Perfect, Clive. I think that's great and informative. I'm going to close off by saying that anybody watching this video that does want more advice on maintenance or to understand more about the documentation, our details will follow the video. Please get hold of us. We are more than happy to assist end users, contractors, anybody within the industry in moving forward in the right direction.